They spat on his name before the dust even settled beneath his boots. The noon sun hung low and hot above Black Creek, turning every window in town into a sheet of blinding fire, and Elias Boone stood alone in the middle of Main Street while a man half his age nailed a fresh property notice onto the wooden post outside the county office. 42 years on that land. 42 winters repairing fences in sleet cold enough to split cedar. 42 summers digging wells through dry Texas dirt that cracked like old leather beneath a shovel. And now the paper said it belonged to somebody else. The hammer struck 3 times. Sharp. Final. The sound echoed between the saloon and the feed store while townsfolk watched from shaded porches pretending not to stare. Elias did not move. Dust rolled slowly around his boots. His gray hat cast a hard shadow across his eyes, but not enough to hide the exhaustion sitting there. "Looks legal to me," the banker muttered from beside the sheriff's office, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few men chuckled nervously. Nobody laughed twice. Elias looked past them toward the ridge north of town where his ranch rested beneath the pale hills. Nearly 600 acres of dry grass, horse trails, and old oak trees planted by his father before the war. He could still picture the front gate swaying in the wind every spring. Could still hear his wife singing softly on the porch before fever took her 12 years ago. Now strangers were already riding the boundary fences with fresh paint buckets and survey chains. One of them tore down the Boone Ranch sign and tossed it into the street like scrap wood. The sign landed face down in the dirt. A small boy stepped forward from the crowd and nudged it with his boot before backing away toward his mother. She pulled him close without saying a word. The air smelled of horse sweat, hot iron, and sawdust drifting from the carpenter's shed across the road. Somewhere nearby, a piano played inside the saloon, muffled and careless. Elias removed his gloves slowly, finger by finger, then folded them into his coat pocket. "You got till sundown," said Deputy Mercer without meeting his eyes. "After that, the ranch belongs to the county holding company." Elias nodded once. No anger, no shouting. That almost made it worse. A screen door creaked open down the street. An old Apache man stood beside the general store with his weathered hands resting on a cane carved from mesquite wood. Dakota. His long silver braid moved gently in the wind while his dark eyes stayed fixed on Elias alone. He did not step closer, did not speak, but he watched the way a man watches smoke rising from a house he once tried to save. Elias bent down slowly and lifted the broken Boone Ranch sign from the dirt. The wood had split near the center. He brushed the dust away with his thumb, staring at the faded letters for a long moment while the town stood silent around him. Then he turned toward the north road without another word and started walking home beneath the burning afternoon sun, carrying the broken sign under one arm while, far behind him, Dakota quietly reached inside his coat and touched a small rusted key hanging from a leather cord around his neck. By the time Elias reached the ranch house, the sun had fallen low behind the western ridge, turning the dry hills the color of burnt copper. The Boone Ranch gate leaned crooked beside the trail where fresh wagon tracks cut deep through the dust. Somebody had already ridden across his north pasture with survey stakes and white ribbons tied to cedar posts. Men worked fast when they believed the law stood behind them. Elias pushed the gate open slowly and listened to the old hinges groan into the evening air. Usually the sound was followed by horses shifting inside the stable or the faint bark of his cattle dog from the porch steps. Tonight there was only wind, thin and empty. The ranch house stood silent beneath the fading light, its weathered boards glowing dark gold beneath years of heat and storms. One lantern still hung beside the porch, moving gently in the breeze like it was waiting for somebody who had already left. Elias climbed the steps with the broken ranch sign tucked beneath his arm. Every bootstep creaked through the wood beneath him. He paused at the front door when he noticed the brass mail slot hanging open. Inside waited a folded paper stamped with the seal of Black Creek County Bank. He already knew what it said before opening it. Final notice. All accounts frozen pending property transfer. The banker had not wasted an hour. Elias set the paper beside an oil lamp and removed his hat slowly. The room smelled faintly of dust, leather, and cold coffee left untouched since morning. His wife's rocking chair still sat beside the fireplace exactly where she left it years before. Some nights he still caught himself looking toward it when the house settled after dark. He walked into the kitchen and poured the last inch of water from a clay jug into a tin cup. Warm already. Summer heat did not spare old men or empty homes. Outside, a horse whinnied somewhere near the lower fence line. Elias stepped onto the back porch and saw two hired riders leading three of his horses down the trail toward town. They did not wave. One avoided looking up at him entirely. The stable doors stood wide open behind them, swinging loose in the wind. Elias watched until the riders disappeared beyond the mesquite trees. Then he walked down toward the stable alone. The dirt floor inside still carried fresh horseshoe marks and scattered hay, but most of the stalls sat empty now. A single lantern hung from a nail beside the tack wall, throwing weak yellow light across old saddles and coiled rope. Elias reached for the shelf where he kept ranch payroll money beneath a cigar box. Empty. Even the small things were disappearing first. He sat down slowly on an overturned feed bucket and stared at the silence around him. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled low across the horizon, though no rain ever seemed to follow anymore. After a long while, Elias bent forward and reached beneath the loose floorboard near the back wall where his father once hid spare ammunition during the war years. Instead of bullets, his rough fingers touched cold metal. He pulled out a small rusted key hanging from a faded leather cord cracked with age. Elias stared at it without blinking. Then, very slowly, somewhere deep in the dark corners of his memory, a voice he had not heard in 25 years whispered back to life. The storm never came that night. Thunder wandered somewhere beyond the mountains for hours, low and restless. But the sky above Boone Ranch stayed dry and empty like it had forgotten mercy years ago. Elias sat alone at the kitchen table with the rusted key resting beside the oil lamp while shadows moved slowly across the walls around him. He had not seen the key since the winter of 1871. Back when his hair still carried color and his hands had not yet stiffened from rope burns and cold mornings. He picked it up carefully between his fingers. The leather cord attached to it had nearly turned brittle with age. Something about the shape of the key tugged at him harder than memory usually dared. Outside, the wind brushed against the porch screens with a soft scraping sound like dry branches across a coffin lid. Elias leaned back slowly and closed his eyes. Then the years began creeping back. Snow. He remembered snow first. Deep snow piled nearly 2 feet against the northern ridge while army horses crowded the valley trail below Boone Ranch. Men wrapped in blue cavalry coats had camped beside the creek for 3 nights during the Apache treaty disputes farther west. Elias had only been 33 then, still strong enough to lift feed sacks one-handed. His father was alive that winter. So was Marshall Reed. So was Captain Holloway. The captain had arrived after dark during the 3rd night carrying a small iron lockbox chained beneath his saddle blanket. Elias could still remember the man stepping inside this very kitchen with frozen gloves and tired eyes. "If anything happens before spring," Holloway had said quietly, "this stays hidden." Elias opened his eyes again and stared at the key beneath the lantern glow. His pulse slowed. Somewhere in the back of his memory, another face appeared beside the captain's. Dakota. Younger then. Silent even in those days. The Apache tracker had stood outside near the stable watching the soldiers with careful eyes while snow drifted through the lantern light around him. Most men in Black Creek distrusted Apache people back then. Some still did. But Captain Holloway trusted Dakota enough to ride beside him through hostile territory. And that alone had unsettled half the county. Elias remembered asking about the lockbox once after supper while the storm winds rattled the windows. Holloway had looked toward Dakota before answering. "Some things survive only if nobody talks about them," the captain said. That was the last conversation Elias ever had with him. 3 weeks later news arrived that Holloway had died crossing a flooded canyon south of Fort Stockton. After that winter, the key disappeared from Elias's mind almost completely beneath years of ranch work, droughts, funerals, taxes, and ordinary survival. Until now, the oil lamp flickered hard as another gust rattled the house. Elias stood slowly from the table and walked toward the back room where his late wife kept old blankets and cedar trunks stacked against the wall. He knelt beside the lowest trunk and brushed away a thick layer of dust. The brass lock hanging from it carried the same strange shape carved into the rusted key. Elias froze. For a long moment he only stared at it while the wind sighed softly outside the ranch house. Then, somewhere beyond the dark pasture fences, a horse suddenly stopped moving. Complete silence settled over the land. And in that silence, Elias realized somebody else was standing out there watching the house. The lantern flame trembled softly as Elias stood beside the cedar trunk with the rusted key clenched in his hand. Outside, the ranch had gone unnaturally still. No coyotes calling from the hills. No horses shifting in the stable. Even the wind seemed to pull back from the house like it knew something old was waking beneath the floorboards. Elias crossed the room slowly and lifted the shotgun hanging beside the door, not out of fear but habit. Out here, a man survived by respecting silence. He stepped onto the porch beneath the pale moonlight and scanned the dark pasture stretching beyond the fence line. Dry grass moved gently beneath the night breeze, silver beneath the moon. Then he saw him. Dakota stood near the broken water trough beside the stable, motionless beneath the cottonwood tree. The old Apache man looked almost carved from shadow itself, his long gray braid resting against a dark buckskin coat faded by decades of dust and weather. Elias lowered the shotgun immediately. "You have a habit of appearing without warning," Elias said quietly. Dakota stepped closer into the lantern glow. His face carried deep lines worn there by sun, grief, and years nobody in Black Creek bothered counting anymore. "And you have a habit of remembering too late," Dakota answered. His voice sounded calm, rough like dry cedar bark. Elias looked down at the key in his palm. "You knew about this." Dakota's eyes rested on the rusted metal for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "I prayed you would never need it." Somewhere behind the stable, loose tin roofing tapped softly against wood in the breeze. Elias leaned against the porch railing, exhaustion heavy in his shoulders now. "The captain never told me what was inside." Dakota climbed the porch steps slowly, using the carved cane for balance. "Because the less you knew, the safer the land stayed." Elias frowned. "Safe from who?" Dakota looked toward the dark hills beyond the pasture. "Men who believe paper matters more than promises." For several seconds, neither man spoke. The old lantern hissed quietly beside the door while shadows shifted across the porch floorboards. Elias could still remember Dakota from those winter days long ago, standing beside Captain Holloway near the creek while cavalry horses drank from frozen water. Back then, Dakota had been feared by half the county and respected by the other half. Some called him a scout. Others called him dangerous. Holloway called him brother. "You should not open it here," Dakota finally said. "Too many eyes now." Elias studied him carefully. "You think somebody knows?" Dakota gave a faint, humorless smile. "The banker knows nothing. The sheriff knows little. But the mayor's father knew enough to spend 30 years buying silence." Elias felt the air grow colder around him despite the summer heat. He looked back toward the trunk inside the house. "What exactly did my father get mixed up in?" Dakota reached inside his coat slowly and removed an old silver army badge dulled by age. The same eagle insignia Elias remembered from Captain Holloway's uniform. Dakota turned it over in his hand before speaking again. "Your father protected something the government promised would stay hidden forever." Elias stared at the badge, his pulse steady but heavy now. "And if that promise was broken?" Dakota lifted his eyes toward the distant ridge where the lights of Black Creek flickered faintly beneath the dark horizon. "Then the wrong men become rich," he said softly, "and the right men lose their names." Morning arrived pale and windless over Black Creek, the kind of dry morning where dust already floated in the air before the sun fully climbed above the hills. Elias had not slept more than an hour. The cedar trunk remained unopened beside the kitchen wall, the rusted key resting in his coat pocket like a stone he could suddenly feel with every breath. Dakota sat outside on the porch steps through most of the night without speaking, wrapped in his old blanket while the lantern burned low beside him. Some men filled silence with fear. Dakota filled it with patience. Just after dawn, Elias saddled the only horse the county men had not taken, an aging bay gelding with a white scar near its left eye. The animal moved slowly beneath the weight of the saddle, tired from years of hard miles and dry seasons. Elias understood the feeling. "Where are we going?" he asked while tightening the saddle strap. Takeda adjusted the leather cord hanging beneath his coat where the silver army badge rested hidden. "To see a woman who remembers what men spent years trying to bury." Elias frowned. "Who?" Dakota pulled himself onto his horse carefully, his old bones stiff in the morning cold despite the coming heat. "Margaret Vale." Elias froze for half a second. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in nearly 20 years. Margaret Vale lived alone near the abandoned church south of the river crossing, nearly 15 miles from town. Widow of former Judge Walter Vale, one of the first men who helped shape Black Creek into a proper county after the railroad came through. Walter Vale had died years earlier, but whispers about his dealings never fully disappeared. Some claimed he made fortunes settling land disputes before papers ever reached a courtroom. Others claimed half the county maps had been redrawn beneath his whiskey lamp after midnight. Elias mounted his horse silently and followed Dakota down the narrow trail leading south across the dry valley floor. Heat already shimmered across the distant plains, though the day had barely started. Along the road they passed ranch fences Elias once repaired for neighbors who now avoided looking him in the eye. A wagon rolled by carrying lumber toward town, and the driver tipped his hat nervously before staring forward again. Nobody wanted trouble with the mayor's office now. Black Creek had grown softer over the years, softer and meaner at the same time. By late morning they reached the old Vale property sitting alone beside a dead cotton field where nothing had grown in years. The farmhouse leaned slightly beneath the weight of age, its white paint peeling beneath decades of sun and dust storms. Wind chimes made from old silver spoons rattled gently beside the porch. Dakota dismounted first. Before he could knock, the front door opened slowly. Margaret Vale stood there wrapped in a faded gray shawl despite the heat. Her silver hair hung neatly pinned behind her head, but her eyes still looked sharp enough to cut through lies. She studied Elias for a long moment before speaking. "You look exactly like your father did the day he stopped trusting this town." Elias removed his hat slowly. "You knew my father?" Margaret gave a quiet, bitter smile. "Everybody knew your father. Few had the courage to stand beside him." The old woman stepped aside and motioned them inside. The house smelled faintly of cedar, old books, and coffee left warming too long on a stove. Framed court records covered the walls beside fading photographs of Black Creek before the railroad arrived. Margaret poured 3 cups of coffee without asking whether they wanted any. Then she sat at the kitchen table and folded her hands carefully together. "If Dakota brought you here," she said softly, "then the lockbox still exists." Elias felt the room grow smaller around him. What exactly was hidden inside it? Margaret looked toward the dusty courthouse photographs hanging across the wall before answering. "Proof," she whispered. "Proof that the land your town stole was never supposed to belong to the town at all." Margaret Vale did not speak again for several seconds after the words left her mouth. The old kitchen clock beside the stove ticked softly through the silence while heat gathered against the farmhouse windows. Outside, dry wind rolled across the dead cotton field carrying dust against the porch steps in long tired waves. Elias sat perfectly still at the table, one weathered hand wrapped around the untouched coffee cup in front of him. "What do you mean the town never owned it?" he finally asked. Margaret lowered her eyes toward the old court ledger resting near her elbow. The leather cover looked cracked enough to fall apart if opened too quickly. "Because your land was never sold to Black Creek," she said quietly. "It was protected." Dakota remained silent near the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on the faded photographs hanging along the wall. Photographs of judges, railroad men, and county officials smiling proudly beside maps they barely understood. Margaret opened the ledger carefully and turned several yellowed pages with trembling fingers. In 1871, the government feared another war in these hills. Settlers were pushing west too fast. Apache families were disappearing from water routes they had used for generations. She stopped at one page and slid the ledger slowly toward Elias. Captain Holloway negotiated something no politician wanted made public. Elias looked down at the faded ink. Signatures, Army seals, boundary markings drawn across the valley north of Black Creek. His valley. This was federal land, Margaret continued, but the captain placed it under private protection through your father to keep railroad companies from taking it. Elias stared at the map without blinking. Why my father? Dakota answered before Margaret could speak. Because your father kept his word. The room fell quiet again except for the ticking clock and distant creak of old wood settling beneath heat. Margaret reached beside the ledger and pulled out a folded document wrapped carefully in cloth. Walter found these records after Holloway died, she said. The county should have honored the agreement. Instead, her voice weakened slightly. Instead, men realized how much money waited beneath that valley once the railroad expanded. Elias slowly unfolded the paper. More signatures. More seals. Then one name stopped him cold. Theodore Mercer, the current mayor's father. Signed beside county transfer orders dated nearly 30 years earlier. Elias felt his jaw tighten. Mercer knew. Margaret nodded once. Walter tried to fight it at first. But the county board buried the original agreement before anybody outside this room could see it. Dakota stepped closer to the table. The captain left one final proof. Elias looked toward him immediately. Dakota's gaze drifted toward the coat pocket where the rusted key rested hidden. The lockbox. Margaret's expression darkened with old regret. Walter believed the box contained Holloway's final authorization papers. The originals. Signed before military witnesses. Elias leaned back slowly as the full weight of it settled over him. 40 years of taxes. Fence repairs. Water rights disputes. Men calling him stubborn for refusing land offers from the railroad company. None of it had ever truly been about cattle or pasture. The valley itself carried something larger hidden beneath it. Not gold. Not oil. Promise. Dakota looked toward the window where sunlight burned pale across the dry field outside. Mercer's family spent decades waiting for your bloodline to weaken, he said softly. They knew someday the land would look easier to steal. Elias folded the documents carefully and slid them back across the table. Then why now? Margaret gave a tired smile that carried no comfort inside it. Because men become greedy when they believe the last witnesses are dying. Outside, somewhere far down the empty county road, the distant sound of church bells drifted faintly through the hot afternoon air. 3 slow rings, then silence. The ride back to Boone Ranch felt longer beneath the weight of what Elias now carried in his mind. The valley stretched wide and dry beneath the late afternoon sun. Every mile of fence line suddenly looking different to him now. Not like property. Like evidence. Like a grave somebody spent decades trying to bury beneath taxes, signatures, and courthouse dust. Dakota rode several yards ahead in silence while heat shimmered above the earth in slow crooked waves. Neither man spoke for most of the ride. There were too many years sitting between them now. Too many truths waking up at once. When the ranch finally appeared beyond the ridge, Elias noticed wagon tracks leading up toward the house. Fresh tracks. 2 horses tied near the front gate. He narrowed his eyes immediately. Mercer's men, Dakota said quietly without turning around. Elias dismounted near the porch and saw Deputy Mercer standing beside the stable with another county officer he did not recognize. The younger deputy leaned against a fence post trying to appear relaxed, though his hand stayed close to the revolver at his hip out of habit more than threat. Deputy Mercer removed his hat as Elias approached. "Evening," he muttered. Elias said nothing. Mercer glanced briefly toward Dakota before speaking again. "Mayor asked me to remind you the property transfer becomes official tomorrow morning." Elias looked toward the ranch house windows glowing gold beneath the setting sun. "Then why are you here tonight?" Mercer hesitated. "Just long enough. There are concerns you may remove county assets before inspection." Elias almost smiled at that. 42 years of building the ranch with his own hands, and suddenly his own kitchen table counted as county property. "The mayor send you to search my house?" Mercer shifted uncomfortably beneath the heat. "Just doing my job." Dakota stepped forward slowly beside Elias. The younger deputy straightened immediately at the sight of him. Black Creek still carried old fears in its bones, no matter how modern the town pretended to become. Dakota looked directly at Mercer with calm dark eyes. "Your father once knew the difference between law and theft." Mercer's face tightened. "Careful what you accuse people of." "Truth is not accusation," Dakota answered softly. The wind picked up then, carrying dust across the yard and rattling loose boards against the stable roof. Elias watched Mercer carefully. The deputy looked tired, older than his years, like a man who had spent too much time carrying somebody else's decisions. Finally, Mercer lowered his voice. "Mayor has people coming from Dallas tomorrow. Railroad investors." Elias felt something cold settle inside his chest. So that was it. Not cattle, not taxes, railroad expansion, water access. The valley north of Boone Ranch connected directly through the pass toward the western routes. Suddenly, every offer Elias had refused over the years made perfect sense. "He wants the land cleared before sunrise," Mercer continued quietly. "He does not want complications." Elias looked toward the porch where the cedar trunk still waited inside the house behind old wooden walls and fading family photographs. The lockbox, the proof. Mercer followed his gaze for half a second too long. Dakota noticed it immediately. "He knows," the Apache elder said softly. Mercer looked away without denying it. That silence told Elias everything he needed. Somewhere in town, the mayor had learned enough to become nervous. Nervous men moved quickly. Dangerous men moved quietly. Dakota stepped closer beside Elias while the wind pushed harder across the ranch. Dark clouds were beginning to gather beyond the western hills now. Real storm clouds this time. "Tomorrow," Dakota said calmly, "the whole town hears the truth." Mercer swallowed once beneath the growing wind. "You really think people will care about papers older than most graves around here?" Elias finally looked directly at him. His voice stayed low and steady. "Men stop caring about truth only after they profit from the lie." The deputy held his gaze for several seconds before slowly putting his hat back on. Then, without another word, he turned toward his horse while thunder rolled faintly across the darkening sky beyond Black Creek. Rain finally came just before dawn. Not enough to heal the land, only enough to darken the dirt roads and leave the wooden roofs of Black Creek dripping beneath a cold gray morning sky. Church bells echoed slowly across town while people gathered beneath coats and hats outside the white chapel near the courthouse square. Word had spread during the night. Some said Elias. Boone planned to accuse the mayor publicly. Others whispered the old Apache scout had returned with army records hidden since the frontier wars. In a town built on rumors, truth traveled fastest when fear carried it. Elias rode into Black Creek beside Dakota shortly after sunrise with the cedar lockbox wrapped carefully in canvas across his saddle. Nobody greeted them. Men standing beneath the saloon porch lowered their voices as the horses passed. Women paused outside the bakery with baskets still in their hands. Even the sheriff standing near the courthouse steps looked uncertain now, like a man beginning to question the ground beneath his own boots. The chapel doors stood open beneath the sound of rain tapping softly against stained glass windows. Inside, nearly the whole town had gathered. Ranchers, railroad agents from Dallas wearing polished boots untouched by mud, store owners, farmers, clerks, faces Elias had known most of his life. Mayor Theodore Mercer stood near the front pew beside the county judge, dressed in a dark coat despite the heat building beneath the crowded room. His silver watch chain glimmered faintly whenever he moved. He looked calm at first glance, but Elias noticed how tightly he held his gloves in one hand. Dakota walked down the center aisle slowly beside Elias while quiet murmurs spread through the chapel like wind through dry grass. Some people stared openly at the old Apache elder. Others avoided looking at him entirely. Margaret Vale sat alone near the front holding the faded court ledger in her lap. The rain outside grew heavier. Elias stopped near the altar and placed the cedar lockbox carefully on the wooden table beneath the cross. The rusted key felt heavier than iron now. Mayor Mercer stepped forward immediately. "This gathering has no legal authority," he announced sharply. "Whatever personal grievances Mr. Boone carries should be settled properly through county offices." Nobody answered him, not even the judge beside him. Elias slowly unlocked the box. The sound of the old metal latch opening echoed louder than it should have inside the silent chapel. Inside rested several folded military documents wrapped in oilcloth. Beside Captain Holloway's original silver insignia badge. Dakota picked up the badge first and held it quietly in his weathered hand while Elias unfolded the top document beneath the chapel lights. The paper looked fragile enough to break apart if held carelessly. Official army seals covered the corners. Signatures lined the bottom edge. Elias began reading slowly, his voice steady despite the silence pressing against every word. The document described the valley north of Black Creek as protected land under temporary stewardship granted to Samuel Boone and future heirs until formal treaty obligations with Apache families were fulfilled. Water access rights, grazing protection, federal restrictions against railroad seizure. Every sentence landed heavier than the one before it. Rain hammered harder against the chapel roof now. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Elias turned to the final page. Then his eyes settled on the signature beneath the county transfer amendment added years later. Theodore Mercer Sr. Witnessed without federal approval. Altered after Captain Holloway's death. A quiet sound escaped somewhere in the back pews. Shock more than anger. Mayor Mercer stepped forward quickly, his face pale beneath the chapel light. "Those records are outdated," he snapped. "Old wartime agreements do not control modern property law." Dakota finally spoke then, his voice calm enough to freeze the entire room. "Promises do not expire because greedy men grow older." The mayor opened his mouth again but stopped when Margaret Vale slowly stood from her pew, holding the court ledger against her chest. "My husband spent 20 years regretting his silence," she said softly. "I will not spend another day protecting yours." The chapel fell completely still. And for the first time since Elias lost his land, nobody in Black Creek looked at him like a defeated man anymore. The rain stopped sometime near sunset. By evening, Black Creek smelled of wet dirt, cedar wood, and chimney smoke drifting slowly through the cooling air. Water still dripped from porch roofs along Main Street while muddy wagon tracks cut dark lines through town beneath the fading orange sky. Nobody celebrated. After the meeting at the chapel, there were no cheers, no shouting, just silence spreading quietly from one doorway to the next as people carried the truth home with them like a heavy sack they could not put down. Mayor Mercer resigned before sundown. Some said he locked himself inside his office for hours staring at the old county maps hanging on the wall. Others claimed he burned papers in the stove before leaving town on the late freight carriage heading east. Elias never bothered finding out which story was true. By the next morning, it no longer mattered. The county judge restored Boone Ranch ownership before noon under federal review, and railroad representatives quietly withdrew their contracts from Black Creek before the week ended. Men who once avoided Elias suddenly tipped their hats again when he passed through town. Store owners offered free coffee. Ranchers spoke softer around him now. But Elias noticed something important. None of them apologized directly. Pride still lived stubborn inside Western men, even after truth cornered them. 3 days later, Elias stood beside the North Valley fence while early morning light rolled slowly across the hills. Rainwater glimmered in shallow puddles beneath the grass, and for the first time in years, the creek beyond the cottonwoods actually carried enough water to make noise. Dakota stood nearby watching the valley in silence while cold wind moved gently through his silver braid. Elias rested both hands on the top fence rail, staring toward the far ridge where survey stakes still stood abandoned in the mud. "Funny thing," Elias said quietly. "Whole town spent 40 years fighting over land that never belonged to any of us." Dakota nodded once. "Land remembers longer than people do." For a while neither man spoke again. The morning carried the kind of stillness only old places understand. No railroad whistles. No courthouse bells. Just wind moving through wet grass beneath a pale western sky. Then Elias reached into his coat pocket and removed the folded federal agreement papers. He handed them carefully to Dakota. The Apache elder looked down at them without taking the pages at first. Your family protected this valley, Elias said. Long before I was born. Dakota's weathered face remained unreadable. And your family kept strangers from destroying it. Elias gave a faint, tired smile. Seems both sides carried the burden a while. Slowly, Dakota accepted the papers into his hands. The old silver army badge still hung beneath his coat beside the rusted key. Together they walked toward the northern pasture where the oldest oak tree on the ranch stood beside the creek bed. Years ago, Apache families had camped there during migration seasons before fences divided the valley into property lines and county records. Elias stopped beside the tree and looked out across the open land one final time. Then, without ceremony, he pulled the Boone Ranch sign from the saddlebag beside his horse. The same broken sign tossed into the dirt days earlier. He studied the cracked wood for a moment before setting it gently against the fence post instead of rehanging it. Dakota watched him carefully. You are not putting it back? Elias shook his head slowly. Maybe some things do not need names carved on them anymore. Wind moved softly across the valley then, carrying the scent of rain and distant cedar through the quiet morning air. Dakota rested one hand against the rough bark of the old oak tree, while Elias stared west toward the endless horizon, where sunlight slowly broke through the retreating storm clouds. And somewhere beyond the hills, hidden beneath all the years men spent lying to protect greed, the land finally became quiet again.